What happens when one of the most tightly controlled political systems in the world loses the man at its center, not in peacetime, not in retirement, not in a slow and managed transition, but in the opening hours of a regional war? What happens when the country being hit by missiles and airstrikes also has to answer a second question at exactly the same time? Who rules now? Because that is the story of Iran right now. As of March 2026, Mojtaba Khamenei has been named Iran's new supreme leader after the death of his father, Ali Khamenei, who was killed in a strike on February 28th during the current war. Masoud Pezeshkian remains president, but in Iran, that does not make him the ultimate center of power. The supreme leader sits above the presidency and above ordinary politics, with decisive influence over the armed forces, the intelligence system, the judiciary, and the strategic direction of the Islamic Republic. So this is not just a story about succession. It is not just a story about war. And it is definitely not just a story about one man inheriting one office. This is a story about how a regime built for survival behaves when the center is hit. It is a story about what really decides power inside Tehran. And it is a story about why this leadership change could shape not only Iran's future, but Israel's calculations, Gulf security, and the wider Middle East for years to come. Because if you look at the headline separately, the story can seem confusing. One headline says Iran has a new supreme leader. Another says the Revolutionary Guard is tightening its grip. Another says the Strait of Hormuz has become a global energy danger zone. Another says Iran's system is becoming even more security-driven under wartime pressure. But if you zoom out, those are not separate stories. They are one merged story. A war story, a succession story, a power story, and a regional order story. And to understand that story, you have to begin with the strike. Because the airstrike that killed Ali Khamenei did not just remove a leader. It removed the single most important node in Iran's system. For more than 3 decades, Ali Khamenei stood at the top of the Islamic Republic. He was not simply a president, not simply a ceremonial figure, not simply an elder statesman. He was the office that connected ideology, security, coercion, and state continuity. Military commanders answered upward into a system defined by him. The Revolutionary Guard operated under that system. The elected government functioned within boundaries ultimately shaped by that office. So when he was killed, Iran did not just lose a man, it lost the anchor point around which the rest of the state had been organized. And that is why the succession happened with such urgency. On paper, Iran has a constitutional process. The Assembly of Experts is the body tasked with choosing the next supreme leader. That is the legal mechanism. That is the official story. And legal structure does matter, especially in a system that wants to preserve the appearance of constitutional continuity, even in crisis. But in moments like this, the constitutional story is only half the story. The other half is the power story. Who can reassure the security apparatus? Who can hold elite factions together? And who can stabilize the chain of command before a wartime emergency becomes a regime emergency? That brings us to the man now at the center of it all. How did Mojtaba Khamenei rise to the top of Iran's political system? Not through elections, not through speeches, not through a public-facing career built on mass popularity, and not through the kind of open political legitimacy that most outsiders instinctively look for. He rose through proximity, networks, and institutional confidence inside the parts of Iran's system that matter most when the regime is under stress. For years, Mojtaba Khamenei was known less as a public politician than as a shadowy insider around his father's office. Current reporting describes him as a hardline cleric with close ties to the Revolutionary Guard and to the circles that actually keep the Islamic Republic functioning under pressure. Britannica now identifies him as Iran's third supreme leader, and major reporting has emphasized that his selection reflected continuity with the security establishment, rather than a turn toward openness or moderation. That is the first key to understanding Mojtaba's rise. He was not chosen because he solved the regime's image problem. He was chosen because he reduced the regime's fragmentation risk. In other words, at the precise moment Iran's leadership needed someone to reassure the system quickly, Mojtaba looked useful. Useful to clerical elites who feared drift. Useful to security institutions that feared indecision. Useful to factions that feared a prolonged fight over succession. And useful to a regime that had no interest in looking vulnerable while under direct attack. There is a deep irony in that. The Islamic Republic was born in 1979 by overthrowing a monarchy. Its ideological identity was built in part on rejecting hereditary rule. It defined itself against the logic of father-to-son succession. And yet now, under maximum wartime pressure, it has elevated the son of the previous supreme leader. That makes this transition not just politically important, but symbolically explosive. Even inside Iran, reporting has noted criticism and unease over the dynastic implications of Mojtaba's succession. This is the kind of move that tells you the regime is prioritizing continuity and control over the revolutionary symbolism it once claimed defined it. And that leads us directly into the secret power struggle inside Tehran. Because even when a formal decision is announced, that does not mean the real struggle has ended. It usually means one coalition moved faster than the others. The mistake outsiders often make with authoritarian or semi-theocratic systems is assuming the real contest happens in the formal chamber where the vote takes place. But in moments of crisis, the vote often ratifies a decision that has already been shaped elsewhere. Not in public, not on campaign stages, but through meetings, signals, access, and institutional pressure behind closed doors. In Tehran, the real question after Ali Khamenei's death was never simply which cleric looked best on paper. The real question was, which outcome could the decisive institutions live with immediately? And that is where the Revolutionary Guard becomes impossible to ignore. The IRGC is not just a military force. The Council on Foreign Relations describes it as one of the most powerful and feared organizations in Iran, with central roles in internal security, foreign operations, and the economy. In practical terms, that means the IRGC sits at the intersection of force, money, and elite survival. It helps protect the regime, project power abroad, police threats at home, and shape the political environment in which major decisions get made. So, while it may not cast a formal ballot in the succession process, its preferences are extraordinarily difficult to ignore. If you're trying to understand why Mojtaba rose so quickly, you have to think in terms of leverage. The IRGC has street power. It matters for internal order, security, and deterrence at a moment when the country is under attack. It has economic leverage. In a heavily sanctioned system, the channels through which money, logistics, and strategic sectors move become political instruments. And it has elite reach. Over time, veterans and affiliates of the security establishment have moved into wider political and administrative roles, which means the Guard is not just an armed institution. It is also part of the political class. That does not mean the IRGC picked the supreme leader in a simplistic movie plot sense. It means the regime could not settle succession in a way that ignored the institutions responsible for survival under fire. And that distinction matters, because the deeper story in Tehran is not clerics versus soldiers in some neat binary. It is a more complicated struggle over the shape of the next regime. How much remains clerical? how much becomes security-centered, and whether the Supreme Leader's office remains a singular command center or gradually becomes more dependent on the institutions that actually manage coercion and crisis. This is also why the succession happened during an escalating regional war rather than after it. Some people assume that in a crisis, systems would delay a sensitive leadership change, but for Iran, delay may have been more dangerous than speed. A prolonged vacancy at the top could have created elite mistrust. It could have encouraged factional competition. It could have raised doubts inside the military security chain of command. It could have invited outside enemies to push harder. And it could have made ordinary Iranians more aware that the state itself was shaken. In a normal system, delay may create space for deliberation. In a siege mentality, delay creates strategic exposure. So the logic of wartime succession is brutal but simple. Fill the office fast, project continuity fast, and do not let uncertainty linger longer than absolutely necessary. That urgency also reveals something about the balance of power inside Iran's own government. Masoud Pezeshkian remains president. Iran's official presidential website continues to show him active in office. But anyone reading this moment as a sign that the presidency has become the main power center is misreading how the Islamic Republic works. The presidency matters, but the ceiling of the system remains defined by the supreme leader and by the institutions built around that office. Under wartime conditions, the center of gravity tends to move even further toward the forces that can manage coercion, information, and internal order. And that brings us to the second big question. What does this leadership change mean for Iran itself? In the short term, it likely means consolidation, not moderation. Everything about Mojtaba's rise points to a system choosing durability over flexibility. A younger, hardline leader with strong security state ties is not the profile of a transition designed to reassure reformists, calm dissidents, or signal a new opening to the world. It is the profile of a regime choosing internal cohesion under pressure. That does not automatically guarantee stability. In fact, it may create its own new vulnerabilities. But it does suggest that in the immediate future, Iran is more likely to double down on continuity, internal control, and alignment with the security apparatus than to experiment with softening its posture. But here is where the story gets bigger than elite politics, because succession is only the first half of the problem. The second half is whether the system Mojtaba has inherited can still govern effectively under the pressure of war, sanctions, inflation, and rising regional instability. That is one of the strongest themes running through your earlier material, and it is the reason this moment matters so much. The real danger for Iran is not only that power changed hands at the top. The real danger is that the new leader inherits a state that may still know how to survive, but is under mounting pressure to prove it can still stabilize, persuade, and govern. That distinction between survival and recovery is critical. Survival is what security states optimize for. Recovery is harder. Survival can be done through coercion, emergency bargains, tightly controlled economic channels, security-first budgeting, and endurance under sanctions. Recovery requires confidence, investment, institutional credibility, some believable path to lower external pressure, and a social contract people still trust. A regime can stay standing without achieving any of those things, but it cannot easily become normal without them. And that is where the war matters so much. The current conflict is not happening in a vacuum. AP reporting says the war has already disrupted flows through the Strait of Hormuz and helped push oil prices sharply upward, at points above $100 a barrel. That matters because Hormuz is not just a local waterway. It is one of the world's key energy choke points. When markets think it is at risk, shipping costs, insurance, fuel prices, and inflation expectations all react. So Iran's domestic transition is already entangled with the wider regional energy system. That means this is not just an Iran story. It is a Middle East story, an oil market story, a shipping story, a risk premium story, and potentially an inflation story far beyond the region. This is exactly why the leadership change matters for Israel as well. For Israel, Mojtaba Khamenei's rise does not look like the birth of a softer Iran. If anything, it suggests the opposite. A succession shaped under wartime pressure and closely associated with hardline continuity means Israeli planners are likely to assume that Iran's new leader will be under strong pressure to avoid any appearance of weakness. A man who rises with the backing of the security establishment does not have much room to begin his tenure by looking hesitant. That increases the danger of mutual escalation, because symbolic resolve becomes politically valuable on both sides. And the stakes go beyond Israel and Iran alone. AP's recent reporting describes a conflict already affecting multiple countries and critical infrastructure across the region. Gulf states have issued warnings. Shipping and energy infrastructure have been threatened. Diplomatic evacuations have been discussed. The longer this conflict continues, the more leadership succession in Tehran stops being an internal Iranian matter and becomes part of a wider regional systems crisis. That is why the role of the Revolutionary Guard and Iran's security institutions is so central to the future, not just to the succession. The IRGC is not only shaping how the regime responds to enemies abroad, it is shaping how the regime responds to uncertainty at home. It helps define deterrence. It helps define acceptable political outcomes. It helps define which institutions get priority in crisis. And increasingly, it helps define the very logic of governance under sanctions and war pressure. But this is where a lot of analysis gets sloppy. The IRGC can shape how a crisis is managed. That is not the same thing as solving the crisis. A security-centered system can suppress panic, dominate key channels of logistics and control, protect compounds, manage black market flows, and enforce loyalty. But those are not the same as rebuilding trust, widening legitimacy, stabilizing society, or convincing ordinary people that life is becoming more predictable. In fact, the more the public sees the same institutions expanding their reach over both politics and the economy, the more the answer to every problem can start to look like one thing: more control. And that can create a dangerous paradox where consolidation at the top increases fragility underneath. So what are the plausible paths from here? The first path is continuity. Under this scenario, Mojtaba consolidates authority fast enough. The clerical establishment falls in line. The security institutions present a unified front, and the state projects enough stability to prevent a visible internal split. Iran remains hardline, disciplined, and confrontational, but functional. The regime survives. The war continues in some form. The economy stays under strain, but the state avoids immediate fragmentation. The second path is deeper security state consolidation. In this scenario, the office of Supreme Leader remains symbolically central, but real operational gravity moves even more toward the institutions that control coercion, crisis management, and strategic logistics. That would not necessarily look like a dramatic coup. It would look subtler than that. More like a system where the Supreme Leader's office remains supreme in theory, but decisions increasingly reflect the consensus of the security establishment. That would be a major shift in the Islamic Republic's internal balance, even if its outward ideology stayed similar. The third path is prolonged stress and brittleness, not instant collapse, not cinematic revolution tomorrow, but a state that keeps functioning at growing costs, a state that can still punish dissent, still fund control, still move resources where it must, still keep the office filled, but one that becomes more brittle with every new shock. Another strike, another sanctions hit, another wave of unrest, another currency shock, another budget squeeze, another regional escalation. That is the slow burn danger. A system that lasts longer than outsiders expect, but becomes less resilient with each crisis it survives. And that may be the most realistic way to understand Iran right now. Not as a regime collapsing tomorrow, and not as a regime calmly resetting after succession, but as a regime entering a new phase of prolonged stress under a new leader who must now prove he can do more than inherit office. He has to inherit control. He has to inherit compliance. He has to inherit fear. He has to inherit credibility. And those are not the same things. There is also one more layer here that matters enormously. Mojtaba's own political problem. He may have inherited power. That does not mean he has inherited charisma. Reuters-based reporting says he was lightly injured, but remains active. And some reporting notes he has not yet emerged publicly in a fully stabilizing way since the succession. That matters because for all the emphasis on structure, systems also need symbols. They need images of continuity. They need rituals that make power feel real. If the regime struggles to turn Mojtaba from an insider into a convincing supreme national figure, then the symbolic side of succession may lag behind the institutional side. And in politics, that gap can matter. So when people ask what this means for the future of Iran, Israel, and the Middle East, the answer is not a single sentence. For Iran, it likely means tighter short-term consolidation, but heavier long-term pressure. For Israel, it likely means dealing with an Iran whose new leader cannot easily afford to look weak, especially if his rule is still being consolidated through hardline and security networks. For the Middle East, it means succession inside Tehran is now inseparable from regional escalation, Hormuz risk, oil volatility, and a wider struggle over whether this war expands, freezes, or mutates into a more chronic and dangerous confrontation. And that brings us to the deeper bottom line. The airstrike killed Iran's previous leader. The war forced the regime to move fast. The secret power struggle inside Tehran was shaped by the institutions that control force, security, and continuity. The Revolutionary Guard did not need to hold a public vote to matter. It already mattered because it sits where coercion, logistics, and elite survival meet. And Mojtaba Khamenei rose not because he was the most publicly legitimate option, but because he was the option most compatible with continuity under fire. That is the real story here. Not just who won the succession, but what kind of system wins when succession happens this way. A system that still knows how to close ranks. A system that still knows how to survive. A system that still knows how to move quickly when the center is threatened. But also a system that may now be even more dependent on security logic than before. More dependent on coercive institutions, more dependent on endurance, and more exposed to the question that hangs over every authoritarian order eventually. Can a regime built to survive still do the harder thing and govern convincingly after survival becomes its main instinct? Because that may be the true test of Mojtaba Khamenei's rule. Not whether he inherited power, but whether a system that elevated him in the middle of war can now keep Iran stable without becoming even more brittle, even more militarized, and even more trapped inside the logic that put him there in the first place. And if it cannot, then this will not be remembered as a simple succession. It will be remembered as the moment Iran's next chapter began under fire, under pressure, and under a new leader whose rise tells us exactly how the Islamic Republic thinks when it believes survival is at stake. That is why this story matters. That is why Mojtaba matters. That is why the IRGC matters. That is why the strike matters. And that is why what happens next in Tehran may reshape not just Iran's politics, but the strategic future of the Middle East itself.